We've been studying in the morning Bible class the covenants of God and how God called Abram out of the Ur of the Chaldees. And this one man God spoke to. This man God entered into covenant with. He made promises to. And he said he would fulfill those promises. And he called him to believe. And he directed him to obey. It was a special relationship between God and one man and God and his family. That family eventually became a nation. These families in captivity in Egypt. And God sent Moses to deliver those people and to bring them to Mount Sinai, where he would formalize his relationship with them and establish a covenant with them. They would be his special people. Now, if I can use, if you will allow me this morning, the imagery of walking. Some of us like to walk, and maybe you've had the privilege of walking with some particular person that you really enjoy walking with. Now imagine that you're walking with somebody who is clearly a superior, and that superior has invited you to join him or her on a walk on a regular basis. A relationship is to be established between you and them in which you walk with them. That's in a sense what's taking place here. God is calling his people to walk with him. And he's going to give directives. He gave them directives to show how they were to enjoy that walk. In essence, he said at first, don't bring anyone else along on this walk. It is between me and you. And don't walk in this special way with anybody else when you're not with me. That's the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. And then he says, when you walk, we're going to walk. I'm going to set the path. I'm going to set the direction. You come at my direction, and you walk with me according to the way that I want to walk. You may not approach me in your own way. Walk in the way that I call you to walk. Remember that when they came and heard these words, there were restrictions put around this mountain. They could not touch the mountain. They could not go up the mountain. God set boundaries, though he was drawing them to him. And the second commandment says that we are not to worship the Lord our God in the way that we want. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. God then goes on to say, I don't want you to take the time of our walking lightly. When we get together and we converse as we're walking, I want you to take seriously the things that I say to you. I want you to take seriously the privilege that is yours to walk with me. And when you talk of our walks with others, I don't want you to talk lightly about the way that we kind of stroll and the silly things that you think about as we're walking. I want you to take seriously the privilege that is yours to walk with me. I have chosen you to walk with me. And you are not to take my name lightly. And then God says, remember, we meet at 6 a.m. in the park, and we start from there. I leave sharp. And if you had this privilege given to you, this superior that you looked up to, and this person offered you to come and walk with you, you'd mark it on your calendar. You'd have your iPad, your iPod, your BlackBerry, and everything else going off. So you'd be there at 6 a.m. when it was time to leave on the walk. Because that was a privilege. God says to his people, remember the Sabbath day. Set it apart. Keep it holy. To keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor. The seventh is a Sabbath. God sets before them I want to have this relationship with you. I want you to walk with me on this relationship. Here's the way you can enjoy the relationship I am calling you to enter in, and I am entering in with you. And then God's going to go on in the commandments that remain to tell them, this is a group walk, and I'm going to tell you how you have to walk and act with one another if you're going to walk with me. But a time came, and it wasn't long after this, and it progressed downhill from there when the people of God weren't getting out of the walks what they wanted anymore. We hear of this in the day of Isaiah. So the passage we'll be looking at this morning is Isaiah chapter 58. As we've been looking at various ways that this commandment was to be fulfilled during the days of the prophets, we read that the people of God weren't enjoying their walks with God anymore like they once did, or they weren't getting out of them what they wanted. We read in Isaiah chapter 58, verses 2 and 3, "They seek me," God speaking, "day by day, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that has done righteousness, and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. They ask me for just decisions, and they delight in the nearness of God." That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? That sounds exactly like what they're supposed to be doing. Well, that's what they were looking like. But we read then in verse 3 that they say to God, "Why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice?" God, we're joining you for the walk every day. We're privileging you with our presence. We're privileging you by coming to you with our requests, and you're not giving to us what we want. These walks are not proving as fruitful as I want them to be. That's what the people of God were saying in Isaiah's day. We're not getting what we want from you. Well, the problem was that their lips were close to God, but their hearts were far from Him. It wasn't that they weren't engaged in a lot of religious activity. There is all kinds of religious activity going on in Isaiah's day. So much so that he says they are multiplying sacrifices. They are multiplying prayers, chapter 1. They are trampling his courts. There's so much religious activity going on. But God knows that there's something wrong in their heart. And so God has told his prophet, just before he describes his people in those verses that I read, he has told his prophet in verse 1, "Cry loudly, do not hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, and declare to my people their transgressions, and to the house of Jacob my sins." Their sins, God says, I want to expose their sins, and here's what their sins look like. Their sins look religious. Their sins are covered with a veneer of all kinds of religious activities. This is the way these people are coming into my house with their prayers, and even their humbling of themselves with fasts. In verses 4 through 12 of this chapter, God exposes their hypocrisy. Because they're working for themselves, for their own pleasures, for their own business practices. They're even getting, it seems, in fist fights. They're agitated either by being there in their fasting, or they're trying to press servants into to serve them, to make money for them. He addresses in verses 6 through 7 their selfish, self-serving, grasping hearts by pointing out to them the responsibilities of true worship. True worship is displayed in brotherly love, shown in tangible kindness. And God makes great promises to them if they will do these kinds of good deeds, these kindnesses to one another. And in the words of James, be true worshipers who visit the orphan and the widow in their distress. Having addressed their selfish behavior, he then addresses their hypocritical and formalistic worship. Notice the last question of verse 5 of Isaiah 58. Will you call this a fast? This activity of bowing yourself down, this activity of pressing your servants hard, this activity of getting into fistfights and being wicked. He says, will you call this a fast, an acceptable day to Jehovah? Is this the way you set aside a day for me, he says? By putting on this veneer of religious activity while still wanting first and foremost your business to go forward, first and foremost to get out of it what you want out of it. Having dealt with their selfishness in these directives and encouragements to love the brethren and do good to the brethren, he comes at the end of this chapter to address very specifically their formalistic, hypocritical religion, their day, supposedly acceptable day, which they set aside to God. And we read these words in verses 13 and 14, and this will be the focus of our attention for the rest of our time today. If because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, a holy day of Jehovah honorable, and shall honor it, or honor him, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure, and speaking your own word. Then you will take delight in Jehovah, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of Jehovah has spoken. These two verses contain a conditional statement, an if-then statement. If something is done, then something else will happen. Verse 13 contains the if part. Let me just tell you summarily what it is and break it down for you. If you turn, call, and honor, if you fulfill these responsibilities, these are the three main responsibilities of verse 13. There's other things to explain that. We'll look at those. There's the conditions. But then in verse 14, we have the consequent, the results, the outcome. Three promises are made to those who fulfill these conditions. You will delight yourself, you will be given a ride, and you will be fed. So there's the basic context, basic structure. We're going to look at it as the conditions, and we're going to look at the consequence or the promises. First of all, then, the conditions or requirements. Conditions or requirements in addressing their formalistic worship. Again, verse 13. If, because of the Sabbath, you turn your foot from doing your pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word. Here are the conditions. Right? First condition is very practical. For those of you who are practically bent, you want to start with what to do. Right? How do I do it? It's very practical. We're going to look at the practical part because that's what most people look at when they look at this verse, and most people, that's all they see. But here's the practical part. Turn your foot. Turn your foot. Now, what does it mean to turn your foot or return your foot from something? The psalmist says that he considered his ways and turned his foot to your testimonies. He thought about where he was going and he said, this is the way God wants me to go, and I'm going to turn my foot, take my steps in the path that God sets forth in his commandments and his testimonies. Or in the book of Proverbs, Solomon writes about the heart and guarding the heart. And then as he describes in the guarding of the heart, then he goes on to describe the lifestyle that grows out of a governed heart. If you want to turn there, it's Proverbs chapter 4, verse 25. What does a life look like that has this watched over heart? He says, let your eyes look directly ahead. Let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. The idea is concentrated focus on where I'm going. Concentrated thought about what I'm doing. And watch the path of your feet. The picture is that of maybe a very narrow trail, and I have to place my foot very carefully on the trail lest I step in a hole and twist my foot on a rock, or lest I step off to the side and fall down a cliff or find myself taken in a snare. I'm going to look where I'm putting my feet, and I'm going to watch each step carefully. And all your ways will be established. Do not turn. That's a different word than in our Isaiah passage, but very similar. Do not turn to the right nor to the left. Turn your foot from evil. The thought is there's evil on the right, there's evil on the left, and I must turn my foot away from all of those and keep it set on the path in front of me. And Isaiah uses that language, or Jehovah uses that language when he's speaking to Isaiah about how they are to keep this Sabbath. And he says, you need to watch where you place your feet. Turn your foot. Give considered direction, thought to where you're going to place that foot. Conscious, deliberately changing the direction of your path, of your feet into this path. It's for instance, you might say to someone, take off your work boots before treading on the carpet in the living room. Or maybe you're one of those people that has the real white carpet, and you know that people's feet aren't as clean as they want, even if they take their shoes off, and so you've got the plastic runner. Right? Walk on the runner. Don't step off. No, don't step over there. That's uncovered carpet. Stay on that track. That's the picture here. Get your work boots off. Take your step carefully. You're coming to holy ground. You're coming to some place where I want you to walk. And so there's practical action is to turn your foot, conscious, deliberate activity as to where I'm going to place my feet. And it's particularly stated in the negative. He's going to tell us where not to step. He's going to tell them, in Isaiah's day, he's telling them where not to step. Turn your foot away from, first of all, your pleasure. Here's an overarching description of how they are to govern themselves with regard to this command, this directive that's being given, these conditions that are being given. The practical concern, turn your foot from doing your pleasure. Now, one's pleasure is that upon which one sets their heart, that which is going to give them joy, that which is going to bring them pleasure on any kind of basis. The word is used, for instance, of a man who looks upon a wife and he delights in her, or a woman that he wants. Shechem in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, set his heart upon Dinah. So much so, he said he delighted in her to the point where he convinced the whole city of men to be circumcised so that he could have her the delight of his eyes. That's what the word pleasure means. That's what we're to turn away from, is these things which are delighting me. This word is used to describe, maybe it's an activity that brings pleasure when you accomplish it. It's food that you eat that makes you smile when you eat it. It's the money that you gain, the bank account that had the big numbers that made you comfortable and joyous inside. These are the things that he's saying, turn your feet from doing your pleasure. Those things that are the normal, joyful pleasantries of life. The word is even used of God to describe the way he feels when his people obey him. He says he is pleased with them. He delights in them. He finds pleasure in them. And it comes out in the fact that he wants to bless them and give them good things. Now, this is what the people said they were like. In the passages we read at the first two verses of Isaiah 58, they said they were delighting in God. They were finding pleasure in his nearness. They were finding pleasure. This is specifically aimed at what they were saying about themselves. It says, do you want to have pleasure? He says, well, turn yourself from your own pleasures. The pleasures of business, the pleasures of the week, the pleasures of ordinary life. The second thing is that he then now is going to open up this description, this overarching description at the end of verse 13. From seeking, he's going to say, from desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasures, and asking your own words. And these are parallel statements that are given. He's going to expand this. He wants them to understand it. And I want you to understand it. I want to understand this, that we might rightly enjoy what God has given to us. He goes on to say that they are to turn their foot from their own ways. Now, this is far too broad. It's just a simple illustration of the path. The path. You walk on the path, that's your way of life. Those are your ways. Whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, the normal, ordinary routine of life, that's your path. Some people call it a rut. The Bible calls it a way. It calls it a path. This is the way you go. That's your path. It's the way you walk every day when you get up out of bed and you do this and you do that and you go to your job and you do the housework and you do all those things that we saw. This is the way that he's addressing all of those commands about not doing your own work on this day. He's saying, don't do walk in your own way. Turn your foot from those things. Take off those work boots. You're coming to this place. From seeking your own pleasure. He goes on to describe the fact that they were to turn their foot from seeking their own pleasure. Now, there's a lot of commentators and some of the newer writers who say, well, this is talking about sin. You're supposed to turn your foot from sin. Your pleasure versus God's pleasure. Your way versus God's way. Don't walk in sin on this day. But the fact of the matter is, there's not talking about turning from their sin. He's talking about turning from the ways of life and the pleasures of life, their ordinary activities of life. He's not calling them to repent here. He's calling them to take conscious direction as to how they're going to walk on this particular day. And so he's going to tell them, turn from your pleasure. Same word again, but he's going to emphasize this in contrast to the ways. These are the things that you do throughout the week. They aren't the ordinary routine, but they're the ordinary joys. They're the things which give you delight in the midst of all your activities. They're the dessert at the end of the dinner. That's the thing that he's saying here. It's these ordinary joys, if you will, that he wants you to turn and consider turning your feet from those. You know, the modern mindset with regard to life is that 5 days you shall labor, maybe. Maybe if you can get it down to 4, that's better. And 3 days you play. I work, it's a necessary evil, so I can play on the weekends. That's the normal mindset, the mindset of many in this world. And that's what he's addressing here. He says, take those things which you are living for, those pleasures that you put at the end, that carrot, that if I can get to that, that's the thing that I'm going to live for. That's the thing I'm going to aim at. And that's the thing, he says, I want you to fix your mind upon and not put your foot in that way. That's the fishing trip at the end of the week. That's the cup of tea with that book that you've just been longing to get a hold of, to sit down. He says, that's the kind of pleasures he's talking about. The going to the beach, the shows, the entertainment. If you want to put a category on this, He's saying, turn your feet from your work, that's your ways, your ordinary work of life, and then turn your feet from your ordinary recreations and entertainment, that's your pleasures. But notice that he also changes another word here. It says seeking or grasping your pleasures. He doesn't say just turn your foot from your pleasures, but from seeking or grasping onto them. When we get a little bit of joy in life, we tend to grasp it and want to hold on to it and don't want to let it go for anything. And we just can't set it aside. But he says to them, you've got to stop your hearts running out after those things as well as actually walking in those things. You've got to stop grasping onto them as you've been holding on tightly to them all week. You've got to let them go on this particular occasion. And then he ends it with, take your foot from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasures, and from speaking a word. Literally, speaking a speech or talking a talk. The phrase is used to describe what prophets do. If they bring a word. It's something more than he's saying something more than just chit-chat. He's not saying turn away from all little chit-chat. That's not the point. He's saying turn your mind away from, or turn your foot away from those words, or that word which dominates your thought and dominates your speech on a normal basis. Turn away your speaking of words clearly from empty words, worthless words, formal words. That's all included here. But it's more along these lines. Turn your foot from speaking a word means something like this. Don't spread your own wisdom around. Don't come in here and don't on this particular occasion fill up all of the airtime with your thoughts about things. Don't spend your time talking talk and giving speeches about that which doesn't fit with the particular purpose of the place where you are. This is the practical side. Turn your foot from doing your own pleasure, from doing your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure, from speaking a word. In summary, this part of the condition has to do with our activity. A deliberate change of course from the normal activities of life, whether associated with work, recreation, or entertainment, that is, pleasure, and the normal pursuits and words of life. It goes to the heart as well as the activity. But then he's going to go on from here as he continues to describe these conditions. There's this practical action, but then he's going to say that there's a general principle that motivates people to take these actions. And the reason that he puts before us for taking these actions is because of Sabbath. Notice how he says it, verse 13. If because of, and almost all the translations say the Sabbath. I don't think the article is necessary there. It's not in the original. But because of Sabbath, because of rest, because you want to take a rest, because you are thinking about Sabbath, because as the world does, they're always thinking about playing on the weekend, and therefore that permeates the whole week. He's saying to his people, the reason you should do this is because Sabbath, the concept of restfulness and taking rest, ought to permeate your life. Everything you do during the week, you ought to be thinking Sabbath, 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 Sabbath. But then he's going to give, after mentioning this general principle behind these actions, he goes on to say that this general principle must have a concrete expression. It's not just, oh, I can't wait for a vacation. Notice what he says. If because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor it, desisting from your ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word. You see that little bit there in the middle? On my holy day, the Sabbath. You see that? This Sabbath concept of wanting rest and wanting a break is to find a very concrete expression. And the concrete expression is this desire and concern for God's day. God is talking not about vacation time. He's talking about my holy one, a day. That which I have set apart and put my character on. That which reflects me in all that is to take place on that day. God is talking about not the national feasts, but a day. It's very clear. A day, a holy one that has been set aside. Now remember, the people of Israel, they knew about holiness. If they knew anything about God, they knew God was holy. They knew he was holy because of the fact that he had destroyed the Egyptians in order to deliver them, and they were an unholy people. They knew about holiness because when they came to the mountain, God set restrictions, and he said, I'm so holy, don't you dare approach me in an improper way. Don't you come up on this mountain. Don't you draw near to me, or you will be consumed. Draw near, but as far as I tell you, and that's it. They knew about holiness. They knew about it because when they heard these 10 words, it says they trembled in light of all that had transpired in the giving of these 10 words. And so when they hear these words from Jehovah through his prophet, it is a holy day. That means it's a day that's marked by the character of God himself. It is marked apart to God himself. It is the day in which they are to give to him. His day, my day, he says. And he even calls it the Sabbath, which brings it very clearly back to this 1 in 7 cadence. This is the rhythm that they are to have. Sabbath, Sabbath, Sabbath. And that means 6 days you work and 1 day you rest. 6 days you work and 1 day you rest. 6 days you work and 1 day you rest. That's the cadence by which they were to live. That was the rhythm by which they were to make time. That's what God is saying. And if this grips you, he says, if this specific expression, this concrete expression of this desire for rest grips you, then turn your feet from your ways, turn your feet from your pleasures, turn your words from your word. If this principle in this specific, concrete expression grips you, then this is what you'll do. But then he says further, as I'm still on the conditions here, the condition of turning your foot. And he's explaining all that means. And now the condition of calling and honoring, which really come together as the roots of the heart that lead to wanting this 1 day in 7. Notice what he says, and I keep reading the verse because I hope even by reading it over and over again, you might begin to memorize it even today. If because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord or of Jehovah honorable, and shall honor it. Right? There's the points. You do these things. Call the Sabbath delight, and call the holiness of Jehovah, or the holy day of Jehovah, honorable. These are the second 2 conditions. And they talk about the heart. The heart that gives birth to this cadence of 6 in 1. This heart that motivates me to want to turn my feet from these things which are normal to me. It's because of the heart. He says, call the Sabbath a delight. This is a different Hebrew word from the previous word pleasure. This is a Hebrew word which means exquisite delight. This is the word that's used to describe nobility. They are refined and have delicate tastes. Not the ordinary food for me. No. Never McDonald's, never Burger King, never Charlie Brown's. Oh, so droll, so mundane. My tastes are too beyond that. That might bring pleasure to the common man on his common day, but not for me. It's used to describe luxurious palaces. In some of these old Victorian, there are films about old Victorian times, learning something about how these people lived in this realm of royalty, and I cannot conceive of what it must be like. Or remember all the shots of Saddam Hussein's palaces? And all the gold fixtures in the bathrooms and the special chairs and the special rooms. And I mean, it's just unbelievable the amount of money that went into their dwelling places. Incredible money was being spent. And he says, this Sabbath, this day that I have set aside, this day which you are to view as holy, this day which has my character written all over it, this day you are to say, exquisite delight. You see, some of you, when I started talking about giving up your pleasures, some of you started going, oh, there's the burden. Remember last week, where's the burden? Well, there's the burden. I got to give up all the pleasures of life. I got to sit in fairly uncomfortable pews, sing very difficult music with words I've got to think about a lot. I've got to listen to somebody drone on. So there's the burden. I've got to give up my pleasure. But it's giving up your pleasure for something exquisite. It's giving up that which is the ordinary pleasures of life in order to have something uniquely joyous in life. I tried to think of a good illustration, and everything goes to Colorado, but I'm not going there today. Imagine that you have the joy and privilege of having a day off and have a picnic with your family in Greenview Park. And you're thinking, man, that's a joy. That would be a pleasure. That would be a delight. I could put aside all these other things. I've got a day off. I'm going to be with my family. We're going to play games. We're going to do other things. We're going to be at Greenview Park. And then somebody came along and said, you know what? You're going to Greenview Park. Oh, that's great. I'm glad you're going. You know, we're going up to Acadia National Park in Maine, and we're going to go to Jordan Pond House and have high tea. And we're going to have our popovers and our jam and our tea, and we're going to look out over the lake and the mountains off in the distance. Enjoy Greenview. And you go, man, what I was originally thought, this was really going to be fun. That's nothing compared to what they get to do. That's the point. You give up, I'll just pick something. Basketball. So that you can be in the presence of the living God? Do you understand then why the psalmist got a hold of this principle? This is an exquisite delight. This day called Sabbath, the Sabbath, this holy day marked by God, set apart to God. This is the day I delight myself in. One thing I have asked from the Lord, that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of Jehovah all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of Jehovah and to meditate in his temple. The psalmist there is saying, I wish every day was like being in church day. Psalm 42 and verse 4, when the psalmist is totally depressed, and I don't use that word lightly, I mean literally depressed. He said, these things I remember and pour out my soul within me, for I used to go along with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with the voice of joy and thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Or the psalmist who said, my soul longed and even yearned. It It was paining him to be separated from the house of God. Why? Exquisite delight. And all these other pleasures, they're good in their place and in their time. But I'm thinking Sabbath, 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 exquisite delight, exquisite delight. That's it out there. That one day that's coming. That's the exquisite delight. And so the psalmist could say, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Wouldn't you be glad if that family that said they were going to Acadia said, hey, come along. Bring your whole family, we'll all go up there together instead of going to Greenview. You say, oh, packing up, we're going. If I can give Greenview for Acadia, any day. He says, you call it a delight, an exquisite delight. And he says, then you call it honorable, glorious, literally. It says, the Hebrew here is a little bit difficult, at least it was for me. Call to holiness, Jehovah honoring. Probably the best thing we could say is call the holy day of Jehovah honorable. Or call the holiness of God on his day glorious. The point is, this is the day, he says, I get to be with God. This is the day, you see, what makes it an exquisite pleasure is not that I get to put away my work tools. It's not because I get to give up losing at basketball or losing at ping pong or losing at all those other things that I find pleasure in, but I get to give it all up because of what I get. I get to be with God. You see, the Bible tells us out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and I think that's why he's saying here, call it this. Because if you can get your tongue to actually say, this is the privilege, then there's a sense in which that's what's in your heart. Not just mere words, but out of the heart, find in it your exquisite delight. Out of the heart, find in it your great pleasure. Here is where glorious things are to be found. And what's the goal of all this? Right? We've looked at the general principle because of Sabbath. We've looked at the concrete expression in his holy day, the Sabbath. We've looked at the root in the hearts that's behind these things. That is the calling of the day, an exquisite delight. The calling of this day, glorious, because it's God's day and it's God's character all over it. But the aim of it is, and it's almost like he repeats himself. He says, I've got this word stuck in my head, this word honor, this word glory. He says, because in the end, what I want more than anything else is to glorify. In the Greek, the Hebrew can be either it or him. And I believe him is the right answer. Everything I do on this day, called the Sabbath, is with him in view, with his glory in view, to make his name known, to point everything up to him. I come back to the first commandment, having no other God before him. It's a reorienting day because everything comes back to him. It's an exquisite delight because everything focuses on him. It's holy because everything is centered around him. And so I want everything in that day, on that day, to be focused upon him and his honor and his glory. So why in the world would I want to speak my words? Why in the world would I want to just utter my wisdom? Why would I want paltry, earthly, tangible pleasures when I can have him, the delight of every man's, the delight of his people's eyes? I want him to get all the glory. It's all focused on him. The day is to come to that state of being, the Hebrew seems to indicate, of being the fact where everything is consumed by his brightness and his glory. Something like what Isaiah saw when the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Or what the psalmist in Psalm 29 talked about. Everything said, glory. And nothing says, Bart. These are the practical conditions. And that's as far as I'm going to get today. These are the practical conditions set before the people to address the formalism. Church is boring, the people were saying. I'm not getting out of it what I want. God says, love your brethren. And God says, remember my day. Maybe it's boring because you haven't really grasped the fact of how exquisite is the pleasure to be in the presence of God. Maybe it's not what you hoped it would be, and the tunes aren't what you thought they ought to be, because you're not thinking about, I want my heart, in my mind, in my heart, in my affections, in my will, I want to love the Lord my God with all of them, at least one day. And so I gladly, if this is what's gotten a hold of my heart, I gladly say, work? Not today. That ordinary way? I'm not walking there. I've got an extraordinary way to walk in. Ordinary pleasures? Not today. I've got extraordinary pleasures. Ordinary words about ordinary things in ordinary life? Not today. I've got extraordinary words to listen to. And extraordinary words to speak on behalf of my God and my King. Because this day is exquisite. And everything in it is marked with glory because it's all from Him. Very, very clear here from the first thing of the next verse that you cannot extract your relationship with God from your relationship with His day. You say you love God, then you must love His day. And if you love His day, it's supposed to be that you might love Him more. It's not just the rest, not just the personal benefit. It's Him. It's His holy day, not mine. If you have no heart that beats with these things, if you don't like the Sabbath cadence of the Bible, well, you say, Pastor Carlson, and I got to say this before I close, well, that's just Old Testament. Well, then I pity every New Testament Christian that we don't have that. What a glorious gift God gave to His children of the past, and He threw it away. Then we are the less for it. No, we're the richer. We're the richer because the Lord's day is filled not just with the glory of God of the Old Testament, the glory of creation and the glory of deliverance from Egypt. It's the glory of the King of glory dying on the cross for sinners. It's the glory of God coming down from heaven and dwelling among men that men might be saved. And the Sabbath cadence finds its rhythm in Him who came that ye might have rest. And resting in Him, we rest more fully in His day. Glorying in Him, we glory more fully in His day. No, we're not deprived of this. This is ours. And may God help us to find exquisite delight in Him. Let's pray. Father, be merciful to us. Guide and direct us according to your word. May your commandments not be burdensome. And where we find burden, help us to search our own hearts and not your law. That we might be free of that which hinders us from enjoying that which you give us. Thank you for this day. And thank you for Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.